Jean-Paul Sartre's conception of the intellectual begins with a rejection. He rejects the idea that the intellectual stands outside power, outside politics, or outside responsibility. The image of the neutral thinker, the expert who observes, analyses, and comments without becoming involved, is for Sartre a comforting fiction. There is no neutral position. Sartre insists that the intellectual is always already implicated in power, whether they acknowledge it or not. To possess knowledge in a society structured by inequality is to occupy a position within that structure. The question is not whether the intellectual is political, but how they are political. This insistence places Sartre in direct conflict with traditions that treat intellectual life as detached contemplation. Universities, research institutions, and cultural elites often present themselves as spaces of pure inquiry. Sartre does not deny that inquiry occurs there. He denies that it occurs without consequence. Knowledge does not float above society. It circulates within it. It legitimizes certain perspectives, marginalizes others, and shapes what can be said, funded, published, or taught. To pretend otherwise is to misunderstand what power actually is. For Sartre, power is not limited to governments or police forces. Power operates through language, norms, expertise, and silence. Intellectuals participate in this operation simply by doing their work. This is why Sartre treats silence as a form of action. When injustice is visible and an intellectual remains silent, that silence does not preserve neutrality. It reinforces the existing order. Sartre insists that silence stabilizes power precisely because it allows injustice to appear normal, inevitable, or unremarkable. The intellectual who claims neutrality in such conditions is not outside politics. They are aligned with the status quo. Sartre's position here is deliberately uncomfortable. He knows that many intellectuals recoil from political engagement because they fear distortion, oversimplification, or loss of rigor. Sartre does not dismiss these fears. He insists they do not absolve responsibility. To speak imperfectly is still to speak. To remain silent is to choose which voices are heard instead. Sartre therefore rejects the idea that the intellectual's task is to provide balanced commentary. Balance often disguises asymmetry. When power is unequal, neutrality amplifies the stronger side. Sartre insists that intellectual honesty requires recognizing where one stands within relations of power. This does not mean the intellectual must become a propagandist. Sartre despises propaganda. What he demands is situated speech. Speech that recognizes its own position, limits, and effects. Situated speech does not claim universal authority. It claims responsibility. This distinction is crucial. Sartre does not grant the intellectual moral superiority. He rejects the notion that intelligence, education, or cultural prestige confer ethical privilege. Intellectuals are not guardians of truth. They are participants in conflict. Their responsibility arises not from knowing more, but from being heard. To be listened to is to wield power. Sartre insists that this power must be acknowledged. To deny it is to exercise it irresponsibly. This insight leads Sartre to redefine the intellectual entirely. The intellectual is not defined by profession, expertise, or credentials. The intellectual is defined by intervention. An intellectual emerges when someone uses their voice to expose injustice that power would prefer to keep invisible. This definition strips the intellectual of comfort. One does not become an intellectual by publishing papers or teaching classes. One becomes an intellectual by taking risks, by speaking when silence would be safer. Sartre emphasizes that this risk is not optional. The intellectual does not choose whether their words will have consequences. They choose only whether to acknowledge those consequences. This is why Sartre insists that the intellectual cannot retreat into abstraction when their knowledge intersects with oppression. To describe injustice in general terms while avoiding concrete situations is another form of evasion. Sartre demands specificity. Who is harmed? Who benefits? Who is silenced? These questions transform analysis into intervention. Sartre's insistence on intervention does not mean that every issue requires comment. It means that when knowledge intersects with suffering, responsibility cannot be deferred indefinitely. Delay functions as decision. Silence functions as alignment. This insistence becomes sharper in times of crisis. War, colonialism, political repression, and economic exploitation force intellectuals into visibility. In such moments, neutrality becomes implausible. Sartre insists that claiming neutrality then is not restraint, but fear. Fear may be understandable. It is not innocent. This is why Sartre believes the intellectual's relationship to power is inherently antagonistic. Power prefers experts who describe without judging, who analyze without accusing, and who speak in ways that do not disrupt. Sartre insists that the intellectual's task is precisely to disrupt. Disruption does not mean noise. It means refusal to let injustice pass unremarked. This refusal does not guarantee correctness. Sartre does not promise that intellectual interventions will always be wise or effective. He insists only that avoiding intervention guarantees complicity. Complicity for Sartre does not require intention. It arises from participation without resistance. At this stage, Sartre's position should be clear. The intellectual is not outside power. The intellectual is entangled in it. Speech and silence both have effects. Responsibility begins where these effects are acknowledged. But this raises a further problem. If the intellectual must intervene, how do they avoid becoming another instrument of power? How do they speak without replacing one domination with another? How do they resist injustice without claiming moral authority they do not possess? Sartre is aware of this danger. He does not deny it. If the intellectual is always implicated in power, then Sartre must confront an obvious danger. What prevents the intellectual from becoming another form of domination? If speaking is already an exercise of power, how does intervention avoid reproducing the very structures it claims to oppose? Sartre does not deny this danger. He treats it as unavoidable. For Sartre, the problem is not that intellectuals sometimes abuse their position. The problem is that any position from which one is heard already carries power. There is no speech without effect. There is no critique without consequence. To pretend otherwise is to exercise power blindly. This is why Sartre insists that the intellectual must never claim moral authority. Authority, in Sartre's sense, is the claim to speak from above responsibility. It is the claim that one's position is grounded in truth, reason, history, or expertise in a way that exempts one from judgment. Sartre rejects this exemption absolutely. The intellectual does not speak for others. The intellectual does not speak as conscience incarnate. The intellectual speaks as a situated individual, exposed to error and criticism. This insistence marks a crucial difference between Sartre and traditions that imagine the intellectual as guide, teacher, or moral legislator. Sartre does not believe intellectuals should lead society. He believes they should interrupt it. Interruption is not domination. It does not impose direction. It exposes conflict. Sartre believes the intellectual's task is to reveal contradictions that power prefers to hide. Colonialism claims civilization while practicing brutality. States claim order while producing exclusion. Institutions claim neutrality while reinforcing hierarchy. The intellectual intervenes by naming these contradictions. Naming is not ruling, but naming is dangerous. Once contradictions are exposed, power responds. It marginalizes, discredits, absorbs, or represses. Sartre insists that intellectuals must accept this risk rather than attempt to avoid it through moderation or balance. Balance, in Sartre's view, often functions as a mask. When power is unequal, balanced speech reproduces inequality. To weigh oppressor and oppressed as symmetrical perspectives is already to side with power. This does not mean the intellectual replaces analysis with denunciation. Sartre despises empty moralism. What he demands is precision without neutrality. Precision means understanding situations concretely, historically, materially, and socially. Neutrality means refusing to draw consequences from that understanding. Sartre rejects neutrality because it converts knowledge into protection. The intellectual who says, "I merely describe," disowns the effects of description. This disowning is where domination creeps in unnoticed. When intellectuals deny responsibility for how their words circulate, they allow institutions, media, and authorities to use those words as tools. Sartre insists that refusing responsibility does not prevent misuse. It enables it. This is why Sartre insists that intellectual responsibility does not end with speech. It extends into how speech is taken up, distorted, or weaponized. The intellectual cannot control these processes. Sartre does not demand control, he demands vigilance. When one's words are used to justify harm, silence becomes complicity. One must respond again. This repeated intervention is exhausting. Sartre does not deny it. He does not promise effectiveness. He promises only coherence. Coherence, for Sartre, means refusing to retreat into abstraction once one's words have entered the world. One does not get to say, "That was not what I meant," and withdraw. Meaning is not owned once uttered. This is where Sartre's view of the intellectual becomes most demanding. One must accept that intervention creates obligations that do not end. To speak once is to open a line of responsibility that continues as long as one remains heard. This is why Sartre rejects the romantic image of the heroic intellectual. Heroism suggests a decisive act followed by recognition or redemption. Sartre insists there is no such closure. The intellectual's task is not to be right. It is to remain answerable. This answerability includes the willingness to be wrong publicly. Sartre insists that intellectual honesty requires exposure to criticism, not insulation from it. Expertise does not excuse error. Education does not sanctify judgment. The intellectual must therefore refuse the temptation to become a spokesperson for the oppressed. Sartre is clear on this point. Speaking about injustice is not the same as speaking for those who suffer it. To claim representation is already to appropriate voice. Instead, Sartre insists that the intellectual should amplify conflict, not resolve it. They should make visible what power suppresses, not dictate solutions. Their role is to disturb consensus, not replace it. This position frustrates those who want intellectuals to provide direction. Sartre refuses direction because it implies authority. Authority, once claimed, becomes indistinguishable from power. Sartre therefore places the intellectual in a permanent tension, close enough to power to be heard, distant enough to resist absorption, engaged enough to intervene, restrained enough to avoid domination. There is no formula for maintaining this tension. Any formula would become another form of authority. This is why Sartre insists that intellectual responsibility cannot be institutionalized. Once codified, it becomes role-based. One becomes the intellectual, authorized to speak. Sartre rejects this professionalization entirely. One is not an intellectual by title. One becomes an intellectual by risk. Risk is the only guarantee that speech is not merely decorative. To speak without risk is to speak from within power. To speak at risk is to acknowledge one's implication. This is also why Sartre believes that intellectuals must be prepared to lose status. Prestige is itself a form of power. The more one has to lose, the greater the temptation to moderate, qualify, or retreat. Sartre insists that such retreat is understandable, but never innocent. At the same time, Sartre rejects the idea that intellectuals must be permanently oppositional. Opposition can become a pose. What matters is not stance, but responsibility. One intervenes where one's knowledge intersects with injustice. One remains silent where one does not understand. Sartre insists that speaking beyond one's situation is another form of domination. This restraint does not come from humility alone. It comes from recognition of limits. The intellectual is not omniscient. Claiming to be is another way power reproduces itself. By the end of this analysis, Sartre's position should be clear. The intellectual cannot escape power, but they can refuse to wield it blindly. They cannot speak innocently, but they can refuse authority. They cannot control outcomes, but they can remain answerable. The intellectual, for Sartre, is not a leader, prophet, or guardian. They are a disturber of silence, a figure who accepts exposure without claiming exemption. This role offers no reward, no moral purity, and no final vindication. It offers only responsibility sustained in public. That is not a vocation. It is a burden one accepts or refuses.